Good morning. It is Saturday, February the 7th, and we begin this morning with the rising alarm around signs of the Trump administration meddling in the midterm elections. The president, we know, has previously suggested that he could serve a third term in office. He's talked multiple times about canceling this year's midterm elections. Now, when he says these things, the White House typically walks back or laughs these things off as jokes. But the president and his administration are taking concrete steps now that should worry anyone who's counting on free and fair elections taking place 9 months from now. MS Now has obtained a message sent by the FBI to elections officials from all 50 states, summoning them to a conference call in mid-February with the FBI, the DOJ, and other federal agencies to, quote, prepare for the 2026 elections, end quote. Now, this comes after a week of Trump calling on Republicans in Congress to, again, quote, nationalize elections. Trump first mentioned it on Monday in an interview with his former deputy director of the FBI, remember him, Dan Bongino, who's now out of government and back to hosting his podcast.
The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting.
Okay, that was Monday. The next day, the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, tried to walk the president's comments back, telling reporters he was just talking about voting reform in Congress. He didn't really mean that Republicans should take over elections. But then just a few hours later, Trump himself made clear that he very much did mean what he said, and he went a step further, targeting 3 specific cities where the federal government, his federal government, he says, should take over elections. Now, before I play you what he said, just see if you can guess what the 3 cities have in common, the ones where he wants to take over elections.
If a state can't run an election, I think the people behind me should do something about it. Because, if you think about it, a state is an agent for the federal government in elections. I don't know why the federal government doesn't do them anyway. Take a look at Detroit. Take a look at Pennsylvania. Take a look at Philadelphia. You go take a look at Atlanta. Look at some of the places that horrible corruption on elections. And the federal government should not allow that.
Detroit, Michigan, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Atlanta, Georgia, all cities that traditionally vote overwhelmingly for Democrats, all cities that are located in swing states. That's where Donald Trump says he wants to take over the elections. And if his earlier comments on Dan Bongino's podcast are any indication, it sounds like he's got more than a dozen other cities in mind, and that he's not just talking. The Trump administration seems ready to act. Remember, FBI agents raided the Fulton County, Georgia elections building last month, taking 700 boxes of ballots and other documents relating to the 2020 election. Atlanta, one of the 3 cities Donald Trump is targeted to take over in its elections, is in Fulton County. The director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, was present at the Fulton County raid. It was later revealed that she's been investigating the entire 2020 election. But her presence in Fulton County raised questions from congressional Democrats because the scope of her job is briefing the president on foreign intelligence threats. Now, given everything we already know about Donald Trump, this is all at face value alarming. This is the man who tried to overturn the last election that he lost, a man who's openly discussed his belief that he will be impeached if Democrats win back control of Congress in the fall, telling Republicans this in January.
You got to win the midterms, because if we don't win the midterms, it's just going to be, they'll find a reason to impeach me. I'll get impeached.
Okay, so at least we've got the fuller story here. A man who's been trying quite openly to gerrymander his way out of a congressional map that's looking worse and worse for Republicans in November, largely because he's leading them into a midterm campaign season, whereupon they are being forced to answer for a platform that includes trade wars and layoffs and foreign entanglements and a brutal, deadly, and deeply unpopular immigration crackdown. But Trump's call to nationalize our elections is more than a transparent call for meddling. It's unconstitutional. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, which is to say very early in the Constitution, states in part, quote, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislator thereof. But the Congress may at any time, by law, make or alter some regulations, end quote. Okay, so the couple things we have to talk about here. The time, place, and manner of elections are determined by state legislatures. In the early years of this country, that meant that elections differed greatly from state to state, but that last bit of the clause says that Congress can and has made regulations for elections by law, many of which are actually core parts of our modern election system. In 1842, for instance, Congress mandated single-member congressional districts. In 1845, Congress established that the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November will be Election Day. But states remain in charge of their own elections, and the Supreme Court has consistently interpreted the Elections Clause with great deference to the states. In 1932, it was the opinion of the court that Article 1, Section 4 provides state legislatures with authorities to, quote, provide a complete code for congressional elections, not only as to times and places, but in relation to notices, registration, supervision of voting, protection of voters, prevention of fraud and corrupt practices, counting of votes, duties of inspectors and canvassers, and making and publication of election returns, end quote. That is the Supreme Court's interpretation of that clause. So even the prevention of fraud and corrupt practices falls to the states. But suddenly, Trump and his White House are talking a lot about election security as the midterms are closing in on them. Staring down historical precedent, while uniquely unpopular, is a recipe for electoral disaster, which is why the administration has zeroed in on controlling the vote rather than winning the vote. And if all this fails, he may just reject the results altogether.
Will you trust the results of the midterms if Republicans lose control of Congress?
I will, if the elections are honest.
All right. That's a lot. So we'll hear somebody who deals with this on a daily basis. Joining me now is Maine's Secretary of State, Shenna Bellows. Bellows is also running as a Democratic candidate in the state's race for governor. Secretary of State, thank you for joining us. We appreciate this. Let's just talk about this for a second. This is not new. It is the playbook that Donald Trump has used in the past, sowing doubt about our elections. What's your initial take, this idea of nationalizing elections, which we should know is not a serious thing, except it's Donald Trump saying it, so it's more serious than we might think?
It's unconstitutional. It's unlawful. I sent the president a pocket constitution this week. I used to head the ACLU of Maine. We handed them out to school kids, and clearly he needs to read it. But he's also terrified of getting his ass kicked in 2026, and he is going to lose when people like me win. That's what this is really about.
Let's talk a little bit about what you do about it, because there's the technical side of it, which is important, what you do to keep your state's votes safe and what you do to prevent the feds from getting involved where they shouldn't. And then there's the other part of it where he sows doubt about the results of the elections. When Tom Yamas said, will you respect the outcome of the elections? He said, if they're honest. It seems to be him who determines whether he feels like election results are honest or not. If he loses, they're not honest. If his side wins, they are.
He doesn't get to decide. The states are sovereign. The elections are free, safe, and secure because they're run by the states and by local election officials in the counties and municipalities all across this country. In 2024, we saw record turnout. Maine was number 3 in the country in turnout. And I think voters do trust the elections, but it is going to depend on people like myself, my Republican and Democratic colleagues across the country, and the people standing up for the Constitution and our voting rights.
You make an important point. Your Republican colleagues, and there are lots of Republicans in this country, election officials from both parties and nonpartisan, who believe in the system. It's damaging for everybody in the long term, including Republicans, to go along with this nonsense.
Behind the scenes, they are as deeply concerned as the rest of us. And in fact, they've said in some cases publicly that this is unconstitutional, that the states control the elections. And I think privately they're telling the administration to back off. But this president is stuck on 2020. He's like that bad boyfriend that can't get over the breakup that the country had with him. And the actions of his minions, seeing Tulsi Gabbard, the nation's top spy official, handling ballots in Fulton County, that's unprecedented. Spies have no role in election administration in a democracy. And, to see the DOJ going after us, targeting the states, suddenly not only are we having to prepare for natural disasters, threats against election officials, swatting, bomb threats, but we have to safeguard against federal interference in our elections. And we're not backing down. We're fighting back.
So let's bring up this Tulsi Gabbard thing again. Nobody quite understood why she was in Fulton County. Then she was in Puerto Rico dealing with something to do with balloting. Tom Yamas again asked Donald Trump, why was Tulsi Gabbard there? And he said he didn't know, although he had earlier said that Pam Bondi sent her there, which is weird because she doesn't work for Pam Bondi. She runs a different department. It all seems to point to, and they did this in 2020, this idea that there's foreign interference in the elections. Last election, we heard about the Chinese and the Italians. Donald Trump mentioned the Chinese to Tom Llamas. There's some speculation about Venezuelans. Again, we want to keep our elections safe from foreign interference, but this actually hasn't been shown to be a problem.
Exactly. And keep in mind, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, she is in charge of spy agencies. And when we look at history, spies have no place in the election administration in a democracy. Now, before 2025, the secretaries would get secret clearance briefings on the actions of foreign adversaries. And the federal government invested a lot in cybersecurity defenses, election security defenses. Last February, they zeroed out funding for cybersecurity and election security to the federal, state, local collaboration called the EII-SAC. And we had no classified briefings in 2025 about China or Russia or Iran or any of the other foreign adversaries. So clearly they're not really truly interested in security. They want to change the outcome because they're terrified of losing.
You guys just veered away from a problem because Donald Trump started talking about Maine as a place that he's going to start sending ICE and CBP. That doesn't seem to be happening for the moment, but they are operating in your state. There was talk, Steve Bannon had talk about the fact that there are going to be ICE people around polls in November. Obviously, this is a problem, right? That sounds a little bit like intimidation.
ICE surged in Maine the day after MLK Day with something grotesquely named Operation Catch of the Day. And they sowed violence and chaos in the streets. People were terrified to go get groceries, go to work, go to school. We saw over 20% absenteeism in the greater Portland public schools. They panicked because the response by the public, including Republicans, Independents, Democrats, was fierce. And so Susan Collins called her friend Kristi Noem and said, please get them out of Maine, temporarily at least. But the idea that ICE would be in the streets on Election Day is unconstitutional and unlawful, because if people are afraid to go to work, they're going to be afraid to vote. So we have to stand up and fight back now, and we will.
Shanna Bellows is Maine's Secretary of State. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
All right, coming up, the former Washington Post deputy editor Ruth Marcus joins me with her take on how the billionaire Jeff Bezos took the Washington Post from its democracy dies in darkness era to a shell of its former self in the shadow of Donald Trump's second term. Plus, new signs of Democratic momentum amid a growing resistance against Trump 2.0. I'll be joined in the next hour by the latest Democrat to run up the margins in a special election, and Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, who does not currently hold a government job, and Trump's golfing buddy Steve Witkoff, who's now serving as Middle East envoy, are fresh off high-stakes Iranian nuclear talks in Oman. I'll tell you what the Iranians are saying and about how it went right ahead. All right, joining me, we all think about this all the time, but joining me now is Michael Waldman. He's the president and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice. He's a constitutional lawyer. He's an expert on the presidency and American democracy. He's the author of numerous important books, including The Fight to Vote. Michael, I need you to help make sense of this, because this is like drinking from a fire hose. All the stuff that Donald Trump says and the White House backs off on, and then Republicans say and then they don't say. What's happening here? It does just seem like it's chaos. Donald Trump is just trying to do what he did prior to the 2020 election. Make voters think there's something wrong that isn't really wrong.
There's method behind the madness. We're seeing a full administration-wide strategy to undermine the elections and to undermine trust in the elections. Some of these things are things that are real. An FBI raid on an election office, outrageous. Some of them are putting things out that will just sow doubt and create the opportunity down the road to say, oh, we don't know who really won. Oh, there's lots of non-citizens on the roll. There aren't.
Yeah, let's just talk about that for a second, because these secretaries of state study these things, right? As many states audit their own elections. These numbers of non-citizens on voting rolls are minuscule. I think the number in Georgia was in the single digits out of however many millions of people are registered to vote.
It's an urban myth.
Yep.
Only citizens should vote, but only citizens basically do vote.
Right.
Louisiana, not a left-wing state. The Secretary of State, a Republican there, in it, hoping to help this cause along, did a big study of their voter rolls and found a few dozen possible non-citizens voting over 40 years. And she said, you know what? It turns out it's not really a problem. Same thing similarly happened in Utah. It's just not a real problem.
Right.
But what this does is stoke fears and create excuses to knock eligible voters off the rolls,
right,
and to make it harder for eligible citizens to vote.
Okay, so there's a SAVE Act, which is, a lot of these things are designed under the guise of making elections safer to get fewer eligible people to vote. On the other hand, you've just got the intimidation factor. Steve Bannon saying there are going to be ICE people around polling booths. Donald Trump sending whoever sent Tulsi Gabbard there. There's no role in administering elections in Atlanta or in Puerto Rico. But talk to me about the intimidation factor and how you fight that. Right? Because if my voters or my viewers are listening to this and they are voters, what do they do to respond to all these weird allegations?
Well, we know because, of course, we see ICE and CBP and how politicized they've become. But the response is courage is contagious in a bunch of different ways. First of all, it is very much illegal to use federal forces to mess with elections. And should it be necessary, there are courts who will rule that way. Voters are going to need to know that this is a possibility and vote early, more than they might otherwise have, not because of COVID, but because they want to make sure their votes are counted or vote by mail. And election officials and law enforcement in states and counties need to stand up. I think this is about scaring people, not an actual legal ability to block the vote or stop people from voting.
You made an interesting point because we did the setup about what the Constitution says about this. There is a role for Congress in elections. How should we think about this? Because Donald Trump said he wants Republicans in Congress to deal with, maybe 15 places. So he's not talking about an overhaul of our election system. Right. He's talking about something very partisan. What is Congress's role?
Congress has a role. States run, as you just reported, run the elections under the constitutions. But under that same provision, Congress can set national rules and has done so over and over again. The president has no role, but Congress should ban partisan gerrymandering nationwide, should make sure that people have adequate access to the polls. And those are pieces of legislation that have happened. The SAVE Act, which is done by Congress, is an egregious voter suppression bill. What it would say is that you have to produce a passport or a birth certificate to register and thus to vote in the United States. And our research at the Brennan Center shows that 21 million people who are eligible to vote just don't have ready access to those documents. Again, all in alleged service of solving this non-existent problem.
Right. And let alone do not many non-citizens register to vote. Far fewer have even tried to ever vote. And there hasn't been a single instance in which an outcome would be different if the 3 people out of 3 million voted.
If you're a non-citizen, the last thing you're going to want to do is walk into a government office and say, look, here I am.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. Michael, good to see you. As always, thank you for being with us. Michael Waldman is the president and CEO for the Brennan Center for Justice. All right, coming up, the former Washington Post deputy editor Ruth Marcus on how the one-time billionaire savior of the Washington Post gutted the paper in the shadow of Donald Trump's second term. This week, the Washington Post announced a new wave of layoffs, gutting the venerable newspaper's staff by at least a third and eliminating entire sections of its global and metro news coverage. In 2013, the billionaire Jeff Bezos rescued the Post with his $250 million purchase at a time when it was shedding readers, losing millions of dollars, and struggling to adapt to the digital age. In his first town hall meeting with the Post staff, Bezos announced, quote, a new golden era for the Washington Post. Adding, quote, I could provide financial runway, because I don't think you can keep shrinking the business. Crucially, Bezos pledged to invest in the Post, doubling its staff, expanding its global footprint, and he was lauded for never interfering in the editorial work of its newsroom. When Donald Trump first became president in 2017 and lashed out at the Post for its critical work covering Washington, Bezos's Post planted a new masthead that read, quote, democracy dies in darkness. According to the Post's former executive editor, Marty Barron, the company's expansion under Bezos's ownership paid off with 6 straight years of profitability. Reports even suggested the Post had expanded its subscriber base to 2.5 million subscribers. By 2023, however, the Post was losing enormous sums of money and eventually instituted 3 punishing waves of layoffs, including now the current one. The former deputy editor, Ruth Marcus, characterizes the moves this way, quote, the owner who once offered runway was unwilling to tolerate losses of that magnitude. By 2024, when it became clear that President Trump was likely to return to the White House, Bezos reportedly started interfering in earnest in the Post's op-ed pages. Things came to a head when just 11 days before the election, according to the Post's own reporting, Bezos axed the editorial section's endorsement of Kamala Harris for president, proclaiming the paper should never endorse presidential candidates ever again. That move and others did massive damage to the Post's brand, and it fueled an exodus of subscribers and, crucially, longtime writers like Jennifer Rubin, Robert Kagan, Michelle Norris, and Ruth Marcus. Jumping to today and a new round of layoffs, Ruth Marcus notes, with these brutal cuts, Bezos seems content to let the paper limp along, diminished in size and ambition. Unfortunately, this isn't just another media story. A diminished Washington Post, the paper that broke Watergate and countless stories consequential to our politics and our democracy, even today diminishes a font of American journalism that now more than ever needs to hold our leaders to account. Joining me now is Ruth Marcus, contributing editor for The New Yorker. Ruth, good to see you. Thank you for being with us. Hey, Ruth, I want to point out, because there's a myriad media stories about where we're all struggling in this environment. But this is not just that. Sure, the Washington Post is struggling. Bezos comes in, gives it some runway. It seemed like a really good idea for a few years. This is about something else. This is not just the weakening of the Washington Post, but the weakening of the accountability that the Washington Post provides to this administration, and how that affects Jeff Bezos and his other monetary interests.
I couldn't agree with you more, and thank you so much for shining a light on this. This is part of a larger media story and the real tragedy for democracy of how because of the internet, which has allowed us to reach millions of more people, it's also destroyed our business model. AI is coming in and further destroying our business model. And so we have a really shrunken and enfeebled set of newspapers and news organizations across the country. The thing that's so tragic about this, I think, is twofold. It's the point that you made so passionately about the role of the Washington Post as a player, a beacon, really, in this media landscape, but also the unnecessary nature of it. We had a good owner before we didn't. We had an owner who was willing to give us the runway. He talked about himself just in December of 2024 like a doting parent for the Post, that he added complexity to us, but he also helped foot the bills. And that is so important, and that is, for whatever reason, no longer true. That affects not just my treasured colleagues at the Washington Post, but it does affect the ability of people across the country to benefit from the news that we were providing. And I think it really ties into the segment that you did just beforehand with my friend Michael Waldman about the threat to shine light on that. If fewer people are around to shine light on that, how will people know what's happening?
So this is really important because it's got 2.5 million subscribers, probably. That's not most of the country, but it's disproportionately important as a publication, the Washington Post, and many publications and media operations are. But they fired reporters around the world, so global coverage in a moment where, I mean, that's the wild thing to do. And then local coverage. And both of these affect the ability to bear witness. You cannot hold power to account if you're not bearing witness in the first place.
We have 3 local jurisdictions. I started as a Metro reporter at the Washington Post. I was in Prince George's County. We have multiple counties to cover in Maryland and Virginia. We have state houses to cover in Maryland and Virginia. We have the district. It's not just that democracy dies in darkness, as a wise man once said. It's that corruption flourishes in darkness. And if we don't have the Metro staff, that is going to happen. By the way, it's not just the staffs that you mentioned that were eviscerated. Every piece of the paper is affected. We lost all of our photojournalists. We lost our audio folks. It's a diminished paper, and it's just tragic.
You said you had a good leader before you didn't, a good owner before you didn't. And you're talking about the same person, Jeff Bezos. And you said for whatever reason, things changed. And they changed very substantially when it appeared that Donald Trump was going to be the president again. What do you think the reason is? What's fundamentally behind this?
There are many different possible explanations, and I can't read minds, but I can lay out facts. The good set of facts for Jeff Bezos is that he was stalwart and brave and resolute and unyielding in the face of attacks by Donald Trump during President Trump's first term. Jeff Bezos had millions, billions of dollars at stake in enterprises that may be more important to him than the Washington Post, and he did not back down in the face of Trump's attacks. It's not just Jeff Bezos here. We saw all of those tech moguls on the dais with the president at his inauguration. We see Jeff Bezos and his wife having dinner with the Trumps at Mar-a-Lago. He seems to have a different attitude towards Trump and the importance of getting along with Trump than he did during the first term. And there is also a business aspect to it that I have to say, I understand as a businessman, $100 million sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money, which that's the amount that the Post lost in 2024, the last year we have figures for. That's a lot of money, even if your worth is $250 billion, which is about where Jeff Bezos is now.
Ruth, always great to talk to you. Thank you for shedding some light on this and for sharing some of your experiences. Ruth Marcus is a contributing writer at The New Yorker. All right, coming up, another meeting of the Velshi Band Book Club. Always our pleasure. I wish we didn't have to pay so much attention to this. All right, coming up, we got another meeting of the Velshi Band Book Club. Today's feature takes place in a world where humans passively uphold authoritarian rule in exchange for mass entertainment, technology, and comfort. Don't think I have to tell you why this story, this warning matters for today, for right now. We're going to be discussing Brave New World by Aldous Huxley with the award-winning authors M.T. Anderson and Claire Beams.